She was torn from her family and forced into a marriage with an Apache warrior, a man her people called a savage. But what began as captivity turned into something no one could have imagined. The late summer sun beat down on the wide Arizona plain, painting the land in shades of gold and rust. Elizabeth Harding pressed her bonnet tighter to her head as she and her younger brother gathered water near the stream. Life on the frontier was always harsh, but it was the only life she knew. Her father often reminded her that every step beyond their cabin fence was claimed by someone else long before the settlers came, and that danger lurked in the silence of the desert. Still, Elizabeth had grown used to the hum of cicadas and the whispering wind through dry grass, never truly believing that her father's warnings would come to pass. That day, the warnings became reality. It began with a stillness, the kind that makes even the birds stop their song. Elizabeth felt it first, a prickling sensation along her neck, as though unseen eyes were watching. Before she could call out to her brother, the thundering of hooves broke the silence. Out of the mesquite brush they came, fierce riders, their faces painted in streaks of black and red, their horses kicking up dust clouds that blurred the horizon. Elizabeth's breath caught in her chest. She had heard tales of Apache raids whispered in fearful tones around the settlement fire, but no tale had prepared her for the sight of them descending like a storm. Her brother shouted and ran, but he was no match for the speed of the riders. Within moments, strong arms lifted Elizabeth from the ground and swung her onto the back of a horse. She kicked, screamed, clawed, but her cries were drowned out by the pounding hooves and the warriors' wild calls. The world became a blur of movement. She caught brief glimpses of her home as it grew smaller and smaller in the distance, the cabin roof glinting in the sun, the fields her mother had tended, the safety she would likely never know again. Panic rose in her chest, sharp and suffocating. She thought of her parents, of how helpless they would feel when they returned to find her gone. Would they even know she was still alive? The warriors rode hard, their pace unrelenting. Dust choked Elizabeth's throat and eyes. Her wrists were bound, but it wasn't the ropes that terrified her. It was the unknown. The man who held her in place said nothing, only guiding his horse with steady command. His silence was worse than cruelty. It gave her nothing to grasp, no way to read his intentions. Hours stretched into what felt like days. The sun bled into the horizon, and the desert grew colder by the minute. When they finally stopped, Elizabeth was yanked from the horse and pushed toward a small circle of warriors who had built a fire. She stumbled, her knees scraping against the earth, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had heard of captives who showed weakness and what became of them. The Apache men spoke rapidly among themselves, their voices low but sharp with authority. Elizabeth could not understand their words, but she recognized the rhythm, a discussion, perhaps an argument about her fate. Every instinct told her to run, yet she knew she wouldn't make it 10 paces before they caught her. Fear pressed heavy in her chest, but alongside it flickered something else, anger. Anger that she had been ripped from her home, anger that she was now little more than a bargaining chip. She clenched her fists, silently vowing not to give them the satisfaction of tears. One man finally stepped forward. Taller than the others, with a commanding presence that made the rest fall silent, he studied her with an unreadable expression. His eyes were dark, not cruel, but steady, as though he were weighing something. He said a few words, and the others nodded. The decision was made. Elizabeth didn't know it then, but the man was Kiona, the warrior who would soon change the course of her life. That night, she sat by the fire, her hands bound, the smoke burning her eyes. The warriors laughed and spoke among themselves, ignoring her as though she were a piece of the landscape. She stared into the flames, heart pounding, and wondered if she would ever see her family again. She wondered if this was the end of her story, or only the beginning of something far more dangerous. In that moment, Elizabeth realized her father had been right. The land did not belong to her people. She was now at the mercy of those who claimed it long before she drew her first breath, and mercy, she feared, was not something they would easily give. The days that followed blurred into a haze of dust, exhaustion, and fear. Elizabeth was forced to travel with the Apache band, moving swiftly across canyons and plains. Her feet blistered, her lips cracked under the relentless desert sun, and her body ached from days of riding hard with little rest. Every time she faltered, a sharp glance or a tug at her bindings reminded her that weakness could cost her more than dignity. She clung to one desperate thought, that her family would come searching. Her father was a man of courage, her brother quick and determined. Surely they would rally the neighbors and follow the trail. Yet with each mile, hope thinned. The raiders moved like shadows, leaving little trace behind. Elizabeth began to understand that rescue might never come. At night, the campfires flickered with life. The warriors spoke, argued, and laughed in their own tongue, their words carrying meanings she could not untangle. They did not treat her cruelly, yet neither did they treat her as human in the way her family had. She was an object, a prize, something won in battle. The silence of not knowing their plans weighed, heavier on her than the ropes. Around her wrists. It was on the fourth evening that she realized her fate would not simply be captivity. The tall warrior, who had first spoken over her, the one whose gaze seemed to pierce without malice, stepped forward. His name, she had come to learn by listening, was Kiona. The others deferred to him, though not out of fear. His presence carried authority like the steady pull of the river. He motioned for her to stand, his dark eyes holding hers as though demanding she not cower. A woman from the band, older and stern, approached Elizabeth and began to adjust her torn dress, muttering words Elizabeth could not understand. She wove strips of leather into Elizabeth's hair and painted faint streaks along her cheekbones. Confused, Elizabeth tried to resist, but the woman's hands were firm, her expression unyielding. Elizabeth's heart pounded. Something was happening, something she couldn't yet name. When the preparations ended, Kiona stood before her. He spoke a few words, his voice even and deep, and the others gathered closer. Their faces lit by firelight, they nodded and murmured in agreement. Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her as realization dawned. This was not ceremony for victory. It was a marriage ritual. "No," she gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, you can't." Her words tumbled into the night, useless, swallowed by the language barrier and the indifference of those around her. She was powerless to stop what had already been decided. The band needed peace with a rival group, and by their customs, she would be the bridge. The outsider bride. A union forged not by love, but by necessity. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of her mother's voice, teaching her to hold her chin high even when faced with hardship. If this was to be her fate, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. The ritual was brief, more practical than romantic. Words were spoken, symbols exchanged, and with a final declaration from the elder, it was done. Elizabeth stood numb, her body trembling though her face remained still. Around her, the warriors cheered lightly, some indifferent, others pleased. To them, this was not tragedy but strategy, a way to secure alliances and honor their customs. To Elizabeth, it was a prison with invisible walls. That night, Kiona sat across the fire from her. He did not touch her, did not attempt to claim her as she had feared. Instead, he studied her in silence, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth dared to meet his gaze, her chest tight with anger. "You've stolen me," she whispered, though she knew he could not understand her words. "You think I'll be yours, but you'll never break me." Her defiance trembled at the edges, yet she meant it. She would not let this forced marriage define her soul. Kiona tilted his head slightly, as though sensing her resolve even if he did not comprehend the language. After a long pause, he turned away, leaving her in the flickering glow of the fire. Elizabeth curled into herself, exhaustion overtaking fear. She stared into the star-scattered sky and wondered if somewhere her family was gazing at the same heavens, praying for her safety. She made a vow in that moment. She would survive. She did not know how, nor what lay ahead, but she would endure. And though she could not yet see it, the man across the fire, the husband she had never chosen, would become both her captor and her protector, her greatest trial and her greatest salvation. Elizabeth woke to the chill of dawn, her body stiff from sleeping on the bare earth. The camp had already stirred to life. Smoke curled upward from small fires, children darted between the lodges, and women busied themselves with grinding maize or preparing skins. It looked, to her astonishment, like any village, not the den of savages she had been warned about, but a community bound by work and family. Yet the realization brought her no comfort. She was still a prisoner, bound by a marriage she had never chosen, living among people who saw her as something less than herself. Every glance in her direction felt like a reminder that she was out of place, a curiosity at best, a burden at worst. Her fear had not lessened in the days since the ritual. It had only changed shape. The sharp terror of capture had dulled into something heavier, more suffocating, the dread of a life with no escape. Kiona, her new husband, remained a puzzle. He gave her food, made certain she had a blanket at night, but he said little to her. He neither forced himself upon her nor offered tenderness. His silence was infuriating, as though she were no more important to him than the saddle on his horse. Elizabeth told herself she hated him. She had to. It was the only weapon she had left. That morning, when Kiona motioned for her to follow him, she crossed her arms and planted her feet firmly in the dirt. "No," she said, her voice low and hard. He could not understand the word, but the tone was unmistakable. Kiona paused, his dark eyes narrowing. Around them, a few warriors chuckled softly, amused by her defiance. Elizabeth's cheeks burned, but she did not move. If she surrendered her will in small things, she feared she would lose it entirely. With calm deliberation, Kiona stepped closer. He did not raise his voice or hand, only pointed toward the path that led out of camp. His expression was steady, almost patient, but there was an edge of command in it that made Elizabeth's chest tighten. Her heart hammered, but she lifted her chin higher. "I said no," she whispered again, even though she knew he couldn't understand. The standoff stretched like a taut rope between them. Then, without warning, Kiona scooped her into his arms and began walking. Elizabeth kicked and twisted, fists pounding against his chest, but his grip was iron. He carried her as though she weighed nothing, ignoring her furious struggle. The warriors laughed louder now, children darting alongside with wide eyes, and Elizabeth felt the heat of humiliation burn hotter than her fear. When he finally set her down at the edge of the camp, Kiona pointed again, this time at the water gourds waiting near the stream. His meaning was clear. She was expected to help fetch water. Elizabeth's hands trembled, both from anger and from the helplessness that clawed at her. She wanted to scream, to curse him, to demand her freedom. But her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she knelt by the gourds, her movements stiff with rage, and began to carry them one by one. It was not just labor. It was submission forced upon her. Each step back toward camp felt like a chain tightening around her soul. That night, she sat apart from the fire, her back turned to the others. She replayed the humiliation again and again, each memory like a spark fueling her anger. She would not give in so easily. She would not let them turn her into one of their own, but beneath her fury, fear still gnawed. What if this was her life now? Endless days of being commanded, her voice drowned out, her freedom lost? What if her family never found her? She lay awake long after the others had slept, staring at the stars through the gaps in the lodge. For the first time since her capture, tears slipped silently down her cheeks. They were not for the marriage, nor even for her captivity. They were for the creeping dread that she might one day stop fighting, that she might grow used to this life, and that possibility terrified her more than anything else. Kiona, seated nearby, watched her in silence. His face gave nothing away, but in the quiet glow of the embers, his eyes lingered on her longer than she realized. The next morning dawned sharp and cold, the kind of desert chill that clung to Elizabeth's skin long after the sun had risen. She wrapped the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the ache in her back. The women of the camp were already at work, tending fires and preparing food. While the men readied horses for the day's hunt, Elizabeth sat alone, staring at the dust beneath her feet. The anger of the previous day still simmered in her chest. She told herself she would not break, that she would keep resisting, even if resistance meant little more than silence and stubborn glares. But hunger gnawed at her. The scraps she had been given the night before had barely filled her stomach. Her pride told her not to ask for more, not to beg like some dependent child, yet her body betrayed her resolve. Her hands trembled, and her lips felt dry and cracked. Kiona noticed. She felt his shadow before she saw him. He crouched beside her, silent as always, and set down a small wooden bowl. The smell of roasted rabbit drifted upward, rich and savory. Elizabeth's stomach twisted painfully at the scent. She clenched her fists, refusing to look at him. "I don't want it," she whispered. Though her body screamed otherwise, Kiona said nothing. He nudged the bowl closer, then stood and walked away. Leaving her with the choice, Elizabeth glared at the food for what felt like an eternity. Finally, pride gave way to necessity. She ate quickly, tears stinging her eyes, furious at herself for accepting his offering. Yet beneath the fury, a tiny spark of confusion took root. Why had he not forced it into her hands? Why had he simply left it there, as though the choice were hers? Later that day, the band traveled to a nearby canyon. Elizabeth was made to walk while the others rode, her legs aching with each step over the uneven terrain. She stumbled often, the stones sharp beneath her boots. More than once, she thought of simply dropping to the ground and refusing to move at all. But Kiona was always there. When she tripped over a jagged rock, his hand shot out, steadying her before she could fall. When she faltered on a steep incline, he slowed his horse and rode beside her, watching with that same unreadable gaze. He did not mock her weakness. He did not strike her for slowing them down. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She had expected cruelty, perhaps even brutality. She had braced herself for it, ready to hate him without hesitation. But this quiet, steady protection left her more uncertain than open hostility ever could. That night, after the camp had settled, Elizabeth huddled near the fire with the blanket pulled tight around her. The desert wind howled across the canyon, chilling her to the bone. She shivered so hard her teeth rattled. Kiona approached, carrying a fur. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. Elizabeth, startled, clutching the blanket tighter. She looked up at him, her lips parting to protest, but he only nodded once, as though assuring her it was hers, then stepped away to sit with the other men. Elizabeth's chest tightened in confusion. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. Yet each gesture chipped at her resolve, leaving her with questions she could not answer. The following day brought another test. As the women worked near the stream, Elizabeth was tasked with hauling water again. She bristled at the command, her pride screaming against it, but she had no choice. She filled the gourds with shaking arms, the weight nearly pulling her into the water. When one slipped from her grasp and tumbled downstream, panic flared. The women scolded her sharply in words she could not understand. She scrambled after the gourd, slipping on the rocks, but it was already out of reach. Her breath caught in her throat, certain she would be punished. Then Kiona appeared. He waded into the stream, swift and sure, retrieving the gourd with ease. He placed it back in her hands without reproach, then gestured toward the camp. His eyes held no anger, only patience, as though mistakes were expected, forgiven. Elizabeth stared at him, speechless. Her pulse pounded in her ears, not with fear this time, but with something more bewildering, gratitude. That night, when she lay beneath the stars, Elizabeth could not quiet her thoughts. Perhaps kindness was another form of control, meant to weaken her resistance. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something more dangerous. The possibility that this man, her captor, her forced husband, was not the monster she had been taught to fear. And if he was not a monster, what did that make her anger? Elizabeth had always believed that the Apache were wild, merciless raiders who thrived only on violence. That was what her father had told her, what the settlers whispered in hushed tones whenever a raid struck nearby. Yet living among them day by day began to unravel those stories in ways she could not have imagined. Village was no den of savages. It was alive, humming with rhythm and purpose. At dawn, the men rode out to hunt while the women worked at grinding maize, sewing hides, or caring for children. In the evenings, laughter echoed across the campfires, and songs filled the air. The people teased, argued, and told stories, their voices weaving together in the desert night. Elizabeth observed it all with wary eyes. She refused to let her heart soften, yet she could not deny what she saw. These were not demons. They were families. Still, the differences cut deep. She had been raised to believe in modesty and order, a woman's duty to her household, her husband's authority, the importance of the Bible's words. Here, the women carried themselves with independence, their voices loud, their laughter unrestrained. They moved with strength, not hesitation, and their husbands did not silence them. Elizabeth found herself caught between shock and a strange admiration. Yet admiration did not erase fear. She never forgot that she was an outsider, bound to them not by choice but by force. Every time she stumbled with their customs, the women's sharp glances reminded her of her strangeness. Every time a child stared at her pale skin and light eyes, she felt like a ghost among the living. Kiona remained her most baffling puzzle. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mesas and painted the sky in hues of fire, he motioned for her to join him. She hesitated, clutching her blanket tighter, but his gaze was steady, patient. Against her better judgment, she followed. He led her to a ridge overlooking the desert. From there, the land stretched endlessly, a sea of red rock and shadow. He pointed toward the horizon, naming the landmarks in his language. The jagged mountain, the winding river, the sacred canyon. His words were foreign, but his meaning was clear. This was his home, his inheritance, his pride. Elizabeth listened in silence, her throat tight. To him, this land was not empty wilderness to be tamed, but a living memory, a story etched into stone and sky. For the first time, she felt the weight of what it meant to belong somewhere so deeply. She wanted to hate him for showing her this. Instead, she felt her certainty falter. The clash of their worlds grew sharper days later. Elizabeth had been helping. The women grind maize when a heated argument broke out nearby. Two young warriors stood nose to nose, voices raised, fists clenched. The tension rippled through the camp. Kiona stepped in quickly, his tone calm but firm, separating the men before blows could be struck. His authority settled the matter within moments. Elizabeth, watching from the sidelines, felt a pang of dissonance. Back home, such disputes often ended with bullets or the sheriff's intervention. Here, it was handled with words, with respect. It wasn't peace as she understood it, but it was something undeniably different from the chaos she had expected. That night, as she sat near the fire, a child crawled into her lap. Elizabeth stiffened, uncertain what to do. The little girl, no older than 5, studied Elizabeth's hair with wide eyes before giggling and tucking a strand behind her ear. The innocence of the gesture pierced through Elizabeth's defenses. For a moment, she forgot she was a captive. For a moment, she was simply a woman holding a child, but then she saw the older women watching. Their eyes were not cruel, but wary. Elizabeth realized that no matter how many children laughed with her, no matter how many times Kiona shielded her from hardship, she would never truly belong. She was torn between two truths, the life she had been taught to believe in and the one unfolding before her eyes. And though she clung to her defiance, she could feel the walls around her heart beginning to crack, not from weakness, but from the undeniable recognition that the world was far more complicated than she had ever known. The desert has a way of testing every living thing. The settlers called it harsh, but Elizabeth was learning it was more than that. It was unforgiving, relentless, a land that took without pity. She had endured dust storms, long rides under a burning sun, and nights so cold her bones ached. But nothing prepared her for the sickness that began as a weakness in her limbs. She thought it was simply exhaustion from days of endless work, from carrying water and grinding maize with the other women. But soon, the weakness grew into shivers, her body trembling even under the weight of furs. Her throat burned when she swallowed, and her skin grew hot as fire. By the second night, she could barely sit up. The world tilted whenever she tried to stand, and the campfires blurred before her eyes. Elizabeth realized with dawning terror that she was ill, gravely so. A fever, she thought. And in this place, a fever could mean death. The women kept their distance, some watching with curiosity, others with suspicion, as though her sickness might be a curse. Elizabeth curled into herself, clutching the blanket tighter, her mind a swirl of fear. Would they simply let her die? Would they see her as disposable, a burden they had no reason to keep alive? Kiona did not. When he saw her collapse near the stream, he lifted her easily into his arms. Elizabeth tried to protest, but her words were slurred, weak. He carried her back to his lodge, laying her gently on a bed of furs. For the first time since her capture, his voice softened. Though she could not understand his words, the tone was unmistakable. Reassurance. Steady and calm through the haze of fever, Elizabeth felt the cool touch of a damp cloth against her forehead. It was his hand that pressed it there, his hand that stayed when she shivered. She wanted to pull away, to cling to her anger, but her strength was gone. All she could do was let herself be cared for. That night, her fever broke into hallucinations. She dreamt of home, her mother's voice, her brother's laughter, the cabin standing warm against the wilderness. Then the dreams twisted into shadows, fires sweeping across the plains, riders storming through her home, her father's face vanishing in the smoke. She cried out, thrashing in her sleep. Each time, Kiona was there. He held her shoulders firmly, grounding her back into the present, murmuring words she did not understand but somehow felt. By the third day, her condition worsened. Her lips cracked, her breath came in shallow gasps. Elizabeth was certain death was close. She closed her eyes and prayed, whispering to God to forgive her for the bitterness in her heart. But Kiona did not let her slip away. At dawn, when the camp stirred, he mounted his horse and rode out alone. Elizabeth heard whispers as he left, the people watching with surprise. She drifted in and out of consciousness, hours bleeding together. Then, just as the sun began to set, he returned, carrying roots, herbs, and a pouch of something ground into powder. Elizabeth did not know what he had risked or where he had gone, but she could see it in his eyes. The journey had not been easy. Dust clung to his clothes, and his horse's flanks were lathered with sweat. Kiona prepared the herbs with practiced care, mixing them into a bitter brew. He held the cup to her lips, urging her to drink. Elizabeth hesitated, fear pricking her heart. What if it was poison? What if this was the end? But his gaze was steady, his hand firm yet gentle. And somewhere deep inside her, a voice whispered that he would not harm her. She drank. The medicine was foul, burning her throat, but soon warmth spread through her chest, easing the fire in her lungs. Sleep claimed her once more, deeper this time, unbroken by nightmares. When she woke, the fever had broken. Her body was weak, but her mind was clear. Kiona sat beside her, his head bowed in exhaustion, as though he had kept vigil all night. Elizabeth stared at him, her throat tight. For days he had tended her, risked himself to bring her medicine, and asked for nothing in return. He had not treated her like a burden or an enemy. He had treated her like someone worth saving. It was a truth she could not ignore. For the first time since her capture, Elizabeth's heart shifted. Her fear did not vanish, nor her anger. But something new bloomed beneath them, a fragile seed of trust, planted by the quiet devotion of a man she had once called savage. And though she could not yet name it, she sensed that seed would grow into something that would change everything. The fever left Elizabeth weak for many days, but it also left her changed. She could not forget the way Kiona had stayed at her side, the way his rough hands had steadied her trembling body, or how his dark eyes had watched over her with a patience that felt nothing like possession and everything like protection. She was strong enough to walk again. The world seemed different. The same campfires glowed at night, the same laughter echoed through the village, but her view of it all had shifted. These people, whom she had once feared as savages, had allowed her to live among them, even if uneasily. And Kiona, her forced husband, had risked his life to save hers. Elizabeth's heart was at war with itself. She still longed for home, still prayed for the day she might see her family again. Yet she could not deny that something fragile was taking root between herself and the man she had sworn to hate. It began in small ways. One morning, while she struggled to weave reeds into a basket, a task the other women accomplished with ease, her frustration mounted until tears stung her eyes. Her clumsy fingers fumbled again and again, the reeds snapping in her grasp. She was ready to throw it all aside when Kiona appeared. He knelt beside her, his hands moving with quiet skill. Without a word, he showed her how to bend the reeds, how to let them guide rather than fight against them. His patience stunned her. He did not mock her, did not grow angry at her failures. Instead, he guided her hand until, at last, the basket began to take shape. For the first time, Elizabeth looked at him not as her captor, but as a teacher. Another evening, after the hunt, he placed a strip of venison into her hands before eating any himself. She shook her head at first, pride warring with hunger, but his steady gaze left no room for refusal. She accepted the meat, and when their fingers brushed, she felt a jolt she could not explain, but it was not all tenderness. Shadows of war lingered on the horizon. One night, scouts returned with grave news. A rival band was moving closer, threatening to raid the camp. The air grew tense, every man sharpening weapons, every woman preparing to defend what they could not flee with. Elizabeth felt fear coiled tight in her stomach. She remembered the raid that had stolen her from her home, the thunder of hooves, the screams, the smoke. Would she now witness the same destruction, only from the other side? As the warriors readied themselves, Elizabeth saw Kiona among them, tall and steady, his spear gleaming in the firelight. The thought of him riding into battle unsettled her in a way she could not name. She told herself it was fear of what would happen to her if he fell, but deep down she knew it was more than that. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. Kiona approached, his shadow falling across her. For a long moment he stood in silence. Then, with a surprising gentleness, he reached down and placed a small carved token in her palm, a piece of wood shaped like a bird in flight. Elizabeth looked up at him, confusion and wonder battling within her. She did not know the words he spoke, but she understood his meaning, a promise of return, of protection. Her throat tightened. Against her will, tears blurred her vision. She wanted to tell him not to go, wanted to beg him to stay safe. But the words stuck in her throat, caught between loyalty to her past and the dangerous warmth blooming in her heart. When Kiona left with the others at dawn, Elizabeth stood at the edge of the camp, clutching the carved bird to her chest. She watched until the riders disappeared into the horizon, her heart pounding with fear not only of the battle to come, but of the truth she could no longer deny. She cared for him. Love had crept in like the desert dawn, quiet, unrelenting, unstoppable. It grew in the spaces between fear and gratitude, between silence and touch. And though she tried to fight it, Elizabeth knew she was no longer just a captive. She was a woman bound to a man not by force, but by a fragile, growing devotion. Yet love in the shadows of war was dangerous. If he did not return, her heart would break in a way she had never thought possible. The battle came and went like a storm. From the safety of the village, Elizabeth listened to the distant clash of cries and the sharp echo of weapons striking. Every sound made her heart race. She clutched the small wooden bird Kiona had given her, whispering prayers into the desert wind. When the warriors returned days later, weary but victorious, her eyes searched desperately among them. And there he was, Kiona, alive, dust-covered but unbroken. Relief crashed over her so strongly that her knees nearly gave way. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him, but she stopped herself, remembering the watchful eyes of the camp. Still, when their gazes met across the firelight, no words were needed. He had come back to her. Not long after, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, riders approached from the north, not Apaches, but men Elizabeth knew by their clothing and the banners they carried. Soldiers, and behind them, to her shock, a handful of settlers. Her father's face among them. Her breath caught. For months she had wondered if she would ever see him again. Now here he was, older and more worn, but alive, his eyes widening the moment they fell on her. He shouted her name, rushing forward before being restrained by the soldiers who demanded caution. The camp erupted in tension. Warriors readied their weapons, women gathered children, and Elizabeth stood frozen between two worlds. The negotiations were swift and sharp. The soldiers demanded her return. She was, after all, a settler's daughter, taken against her will. Kiona stood firm, his jaw set, refusing at first. To him, she was his wife, bound by their customs. But Elizabeth could see the war in his eyes, not against the soldiers, but against the possibility of losing her. Her father called out to her, his voice breaking, "Elizabeth, come here now. We're taking you home." The word home struck her like an arrow. For so long, she had dreamed of it. The cabin, the fields, her mother's gentle voice. Yet as she looked around the Apache camp, at the women who had taught her, at the children who laughed at her pale hair, at the man who had saved her life, she realized the meaning of home had changed. The soldiers pressed closer. "We'll remove her by force if we must," one barked. Elizabeth's heart pounded. Everyone was watching. The Apaches, tense and ready for violence. The soldiers, impatient and suspicious. Her father, desperate with hope. And Kiona, silent, his eyes locked on hers, offering no command, only a choice. Tears burned her eyes as she stepped forward. For a moment, it seemed she would go to her father. But then, to the shock of all, she turned and moved to stand beside Kiona. A murmur swept through both sides. Her father's face went pale. "Elizabeth, no. You don't understand." He's taken you. You don't belong with them." Her voice trembled, but it was steady. "I do understand, Father. He didn't just take me. He saved me. He protected me when I was weak. He is my husband." The words hung heavy in the air. The soldiers stared, stunned. The Apache warriors stood taller, pride flickering in their eyes. And her father, broken, bewildered, shook his head as though the ground had fallen away beneath him. Elizabeth reached for Kiona's hand. For the first time, she took it openly, willingly. His grip was firm, steady, a silent vow of solidarity. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice carrying across the silence. "This is where I choose to be." The soldiers protested, her father begged, but nothing moved her. She had made her choice. It was the shock of her life, the shock of two peoples divided by hatred, the shock of a young woman once torn from her world who now stood boldly in a new one. Elizabeth Harding, the settler's daughter, had fallen in love with the man she was forced to marry, and by choosing him, she bridged a chasm no one believed could ever be crossed. And though the road ahead would be fraught with trials, in that moment, with the desert wind curling around them and the weight of countless eyes upon her, Elizabeth felt something she had not known in months. She felt free.